history of the treatment of the Indigenous people of this land is an awful story. Australia was settled in a period of time where colonialism was the usual practice of places like Portugal, Spain, France, and England. Australia was deemed to be terra nullius, which is a Latin word which means an empty land. And that being the case, it required populating and had permission to do so. And yet we know it was an empty land. There were 300 nations here who had been here for thousands of years. It was a terrible injustice at the time, and it still is. The Christian church was seen as complicit and at times active in the process of colonialism. Yet the story's not quite that simple. In fact, it's quite a complex picture. And this place where we stand, which is called Warringezda, demonstrates the complexity of that picture. This was set up by John Gribble in 1880. It's just near the Murrumbidgee River, near a place called Darlington Point. John Gribble was a local church minister, and he had a comfortable existence, but he was so pained by what he saw for the Aboriginal Indigenous people in this area. It was a tragic set of circumstances, and he felt he must do something about it. He wanted to create a place where there was safety and education and a future for the Indigenous of this region. The great Indigenous activist, Bill Ferguson, whose statue stands in the middle of Dubbo, was educated here in Warringezda. There are lots of places where the Christian Church's history with the Indigenous of this nation is not a good story. And yet there are greats like John Gribble and Lancelot Threkold who gave their lives for these people.
There is a faith in this country that is born within the First Nations peoples. It is so deep, it is in the soil, it's in every living thing that surrounds us. It permeates our world. There's nothing that is richer than that.
Why did the British Empire think it was okay just to turn up and take the land?
Well, that's the terra nullius thing. That is that open land, land which nobody owns, is free for the taking. Now, the only place in the world that could be seen to perhaps be true might be Antarctica. Nobody claims it. You could claim a bit. But when it came to Australia, well, they had to twist the rules. Now, terra nullius says this is an empty land and anyone can take it. So how do they know it's an empty land? Well, when they come, they see no wharves, they see no church steeples, they see no fences, gardens, they see no anything which they would regard as the evidence of civilization.
Who then started to seek to bring the message of Jesus to Indigenous people?
It wasn't until the 1820s, a good 50 years after European colonisation invasion of Australia. This was a guy called Lancelot Threkold. He had been a missionary with the London Missionary Society out in Hawaii, in Tahiti, and he arrived in Sydney and he was shocked that there had been no or very little humanitarian assistance to Aboriginal people and very minimal efforts to communicate the gospel. So he established a mission up around Lake Macquarie, and he worked closely with a man called Birrabin to translate the Gospel of Luke into Awabakal.
One of the most effective ways that the gospel was influencing the Indigenous people was through their own evangelists. How did that start?
Yeah, people have this idea that it was white missionaries, and it's always white missionaries going into communities, but it's Indigenous people evangelising each other have always been the way through which the gospel has spread.
Well, Barnabas Roberts came from the Europa River region in the Northern Territory. The community is now called Ngukur, where his descendants now live. And Barnabas Roberts went on to become an evangelist. He was a man of short stature, and he had a foot that went that way, sideways, because of an accident on a horse. And he walked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles preaching the gospel. He, like Nathaniel Pepper, is one who famously said, if the missionaries hadn't come, my people would all have been shot down.
That Nathaniel Pepper was my mother's great-great-grandfather.
It's a pretty special story, Nathaniel Pepper, isn't it?
When you think about when Nathaniel Pepper actually became a Christian, it was in one of those times when very few people were ministering and having success with Aboriginal people. And it was one of those rare events that really took the centre stage in history in that sense of being like conversion for Aboriginal people.
Indeed, there's a trend in Indigenous history now to, even among self-confessed atheists, to confess that the more they look at the evidence, the more they realise the only people in colonial Australia who cared for the fate of the Indigenous people were the most devout Christians. So secular thinking at the time was, oh, this is a dying race. Who cares? Commercial interests must come first. So if they're exterminated along the way, well, that's just the price we have to pay. Only Christian voices were speaking up. Now, admittedly, the churches could have done still more, but that's a narrative that is more or less commonly accepted now.
I want to jump forward to another area, which is a very difficult area in our history that's referred to as the Stolen Generation. Who were the Stolen Generation and what was happening?
The Stolen Generation were those children who were removed from their families, but not just in the same way that a white child, a European child might be removed, let's say, for negligence or whatever. In other words, a child who was born to an Aboriginal family could be presumed to be not cared for by law.
And in that process, the church was complicit.
The church was complicit. Firstly, our biggest error was we did not speak out against it. We were not prophetic. But secondly, the church very rarely took children. I'm not saying never, but very rarely did the church take children, but they did receive these children into orphanages and so on that were run by the church, so they were complicit in the accepting of these children, who were brought to them by police or truant officers or whatever.
Yeah. Did your family have any connection to the Stolen Generation?
Yeah. My husband, William, his grandfather was part of the Stolen Generation. They grew up in the Biripi country, which is down in Taree, Tuncurry, down there. And, they were taken. He was taken as a young man, placed into a place called Kinchela Boys Home. It wasn't a very, very nice place at all. So he came out a very hard, tough man. And then, so a lot of his hurt, a lot of his trauma were passed on then to his sons and family down the line. And it wasn't till my husband's generation that all started to get saved that a lot of things started to break over our family.
Wow.
Yeah.
I grew up in this country at a time when there was great change, social change afoot. I looked at what I could see in the small country town where I was growing up, and the people, to me, who seemed the most silent about the social injustice of the day were the Christians, the churches. Indignation, if you like, an anger that I couldn't even understand myself, but it almost consumed me because as if I felt as if I'd been sold a pup. I felt as if all the stories that my father and my mother told me about this man, Jesus, they had a hollow ring to them, you know?
So Riverbank, we're here in Dubbo, and this statue is Bill Ferguson. So tell us about Bill Ferguson. Who was Bill Ferguson?
Bill Ferguson was an Aboriginal freedom fighter, born of a Scottish father and a Wiradjuri mother. Came from Darlington Point, down on the Murrumbidgee, and in the 1930s and 40s.
Where did he get his education?
At a mission school that was set up by, people of faith down on the Murrumbidgee, probably down there somewhere, Warringasta.
Yep.
Well, Ferguson, his road to Damascus moment, as it were, came when he was about 18 or 19, working in the sheds. It was as if for the first time he noticed that when they got paid for their work, his cousins were paid less than him. He asked his father about this, and his father said it's the colour of their skin. I believe it was in that moment that Ferguson, the real William Ferguson, was born. He stood up. He decided in his heart of hearts, I believe, that from there on in he was going to make a difference, and he did.
What were the sort of things that Bill Ferguson was fighting for?
Bill Ferguson, I like to think of Bill Ferguson as our Martin Luther King. In a lot of ways, he was asking for the same things. He wanted to sit down at the table of brotherhood, as it were, and share from the same meal as everybody else.
That is interesting, isn't it, at Riverbank, that he didn't need to fight the battle for himself.
Yeah, he could, you see, he had, as I already said, he had fairer complexion than the average blackfella.
Yeah.
He could have passed. He could have been a Lebanese or a Middle Eastern man. He could have been Turkish, whatever. You know? But he chose instead to take up his cross, as it were. In the end, it cost him his life. William Ferguson walked down a road, a very lonely road. He spoke a language nobody really understood at the time, because he was saying, what about the indigenous people? What about the first peoples?
Yeah.
Ferguson was a man who had the courage of his convictions, and he lived out what he believed in.
In your pastoral care of students, what are some of the challenges that the Indigenous students there face?
So we do have transgenerational trauma. We have a lot of sorry business. Students, a lot of the time, haven't got a strong connection to culture. The biggest thing would be just identity and trauma and sorry business. Yeah.
What's sorry business?
So a lot of deaths. So students have to go home for a lot of deaths. People don't generally know the stats and things, but in Lockhart River, the average age for a male is 45. And so those kinds of things play out in our everyday life.
To see Aboriginal people struggling today in a community fraught with death, fraught with family violence, drugs and alcoholism, and the little Christian band tries to keep together. And there, one minister, who I won't name the place or everything else, the year before last took 52 funerals. How do you preach or prepare a Bible study or something like that when your whole year is spent in crisis management, anger management and grief?
My sister, in the middle of the day, was locked up for drunkenness in the middle of the day in Brewarrina. And if you know anything about deaths in custody, 10 years before, there was also a death in custody in 1987. And that community erupted into violence, and my family were involved. at the shock of a person dying in police custody in our little town. So 10 years later, I knew what I was presented with, that this couldn't happen again. I just spent all my parts of my life dedicating it to improving relationships and opportunities for Aboriginal people. How can this happen? Not to realise in 1997 my sister would die in the same police cell as the one who did in 1987.
I grew up experiencing a lot of racism, which of course has an enormous impact upon your life. In my secondary school, we were talking about our teacher asked, what did you want to do when you were leaving school? And I said I wanted to, and I was the only Aboriginal student in the class, and I said I wanted to go to university. And her, along with the students, mocked me and laughed at me.
Wow.
And said, you know, black people only work with their hands, that'll never happen. So that spurred me, that stayed in my belly, and it was like a little flame. And it was like, yeah, I'm going to prove you wrong.
In 87, there was a riot. What happened in 97?
We were absolutely presented with the opportunity to do exactly the same thing. I was the eldest brother of four, and in our community, people see me as a leader. People see me as the sort of front runner to many things. They'll consult me on issues. And on this one, I was absolutely consulted about we would take the police on, burn Brewarrina to the ground, and lots of people would get hurt. That's what I was presented with within a day of my sister passing away. And that's when this story all changed. My life had changed when I was presented with that opportunity, and when we chose the right decision, myself and my dad, everything changed in my life.
You went to Sydney, to Redfern. If we met you then, what would you have been like?
You wouldn't have met me. We wouldn't have crossed on the same side of the street.
Yeah.
And if we did, chances are I'd have been in your face. It makes me laugh now in hindsight. All 3 foot of me, you know, but in my mind I was a black revolutionary, so I wanted the conflict, and I wanted you to know that you were living in a stolen country.
There were many parts of my family who really wanted to disturb the peace, particularly between our local people and the police. I started to formulate a plan that could train and develop Aboriginal young people, particularly to go and work in New South Wales Police, and then come back to our communities to help make that social change so we could develop our relationship. Well, I can see potential for real jobs for these young people, to give them hope.
Pursued education. What did you do?
I did my theological studies at UTS and Nungalinga. I also went to Sydney University and Flinders University and did theological studies.
Was your mum around when you got your PhD?
Yeah.
What was that like for her?
I was the first Aboriginal to be graduating with a PhD from Sydney University. She was absolutely excited.
Yeah, so we're in East Dubbo, and we're in what they call Apollo Estate. So it's Apollo Estate is a public housing estate.
Yep.
It's predominantly Aboriginal people that live here, and it was one of 3 of our housing estates within the city.
What's the big challenge, you say, for young people out here that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so getting out of disadvantage, as it's been for generations. If you live an impoverished life, where do you see opportunities? And the statistics on our young people entering into the justice system is worse now than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And so even after all of the investments by different layers of government, we still have such disadvantage. And so if you get a good education, you get the best opportunity to get the best job.
I spent 10 years at least living and working on the main streets of Mount Druitt. Yeah, I met a guy who had an left an indelible imprint in my life. Father Paul Hanna from the local Catholic parish there. And I just saw that this, for the first time in my life, I met a priest who had a social conscience and who wanted to work with people, and in particular my people, or the people on the margins. And suddenly it was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
Wow. So what happens now, Peter?
We've got a program called iProud. It's an Indigenous policing program for Aboriginal people, and it's right across New South Wales. We've trained hundreds of people who've made their way into the police force. There's an award for those students in her name.
Wow.
We've overcome so much hurt and grief and anger by having a different relationship.
So given the poor history of the church connected to colonialism, is it surprising there are so many Aboriginals that are Christians?
No. There's a scripture in Ecclesiastes 3:11 where it talks about God had planted eternity in the hearts of man. And when you're asked the question, was God here before colonisation? The answer is yes. He is such a big and great God that when we think that he is limited to just colonisation of different continents, we actually limit who God is.
Mm-hmm.
But we still needed Jesus Christ to come through.
Does the church among Indigenous people in Australia continue to grow?
In the church, not in the four walls, but out in community, yeah.
What about the relationship between the Christian church and the Indigenous population of Australia? That's seen as sometimes being contentious. How is that reflected in their belief?
Well, if you look at census data on this, just under 3% of Australians identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are more likely than the average Australian to identify their faith as Christianity. So as I said, 52% of the national population say Christianity, 58% of those who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander say Christianity.
Yeah.
You would expect, because of the injustices that they have endured, especially even at the hands of the church and at the hands of white Christians, people like me, there would be many people would want nothing to do with Christianity, but actually quite the opposite. There are many Indigenous people who are proudly Christian.
I came back to Dubbo. I ran into a mate of mine called Bowen. Cole used to always ask me, he'd say, why don't you come to church? In the end, yeah, I went along with him, went back to church, and I've been a member of that place now for over 10 years, and Sundays are the biggest day of my week, so
wow.
That gave me the chance again to reconnect with my faith and to reset my course, as it were.
Yeah. So what do you think would help bring reconciliation?
Look, that is something I think we've grappled with for a long, long time over the years. For me, the only way reconciliation can be achieved is through education. We've got to be able to talk about our history, warts and all, you know, because it belongs to both of us. And for me, you know, for church, for Christian people, for us who all profess our faith in Jesus Christ and have all been, you know, transformed as a result of that through grace, then I can't understand why we're not at the forefront of this conversation.
I can't see a future without forgiveness. In many ways, until we come to a place of understanding forgiveness, we will just go on being the hatred being perpetuated in family after family. I've come to that understanding that if we can come to a place of forgiveness, and I know because I had to deal with it in my own heart, and only the Lord could help me deal with forgiveness, real forgiveness, not just saying sorry and moving on, but you got to say sorry and you got to forgive. Brother, I just cannot see a place without it.